In this lecture, we're going to cover disturbance and how plants actually grow and respond to those forces. And this is really going to start getting into the applied portion of, rangeland management. So let's again just review really quickly the different functional categories that plants are classified into. So we have annuals and perennials, as well as our woody shrub species. And then there's also the dynamic of whether those plants come on in the cool season or warm season. And then if you guys remember back to the plant section, we were also talking about plants developing or evolving with certain characteristics that will allow them to either be grazed or not grazed, or have some sort of tolerance to heavy grazing. So those can either be chemical or physical. So all of these different ways that we categorize plants, and a lot of plants are going to fall into all of these different categories just at a different level. These factors are really how plants are going to respond to disturbance. So we have to take all of these things into account as we're trying to deal with some sort of disturbance. So again, the major plant groups that you're going to see on rangeland are going to be trees, shrubs, forbs, and grasses or grass-like species. Keep in mind that our forbs and our shrubs are really dicots in nature, whereas the grasses and the grass-like species are monocots in nature. So when it comes to how a plant is going to respond, there's four major points that you need to take into effect. And we're going to talk about all these more in depth, but they are location of growth points, or growth limiting factors, the root systems that plants have, as well as how they store carbohydrates and energy for growth. So if we look at the grasses very quickly first, let's make sure that we know where our growing points are. And it's important to know where the growing points are because if you take those off, like through an intensive grazing bout or have a drought or actually do some mowing at the wrong time, you can actually not get any growth back after that point because their growing points are going to be gone. So in this figure here, we've got a couple blades of grass that are going to have growing points, basal growing points, so growing points that are very, very close to the soil. And then we have elevated growing points. So there's two types of growing points on grasses. They are also called buds or meristems, depending on what text you're actually looking at. So basal growing points are going to be closer to the soil, whereas elevated growing points are going to be nodes that are going to be associated with the joint of the plant. So here's just another look at grasses and their ability to combat some sort of disturbance. So here on the left-hand side, we've got a piece of grass that has been disturbed or part of it's been taken. So this could be intensive grazing, or it could be like your lawn after you mow it. So you take everything off at one level. So grasses are unique because they actually, as long as you don't remove the growing points, so here we've got an elevated growing point, these grasses are going to push growth from the growing point upwards. So the older growth is actually up here, and the newer growth is right next to the node. So as newer growth is going to start getting more and more abundant, it's pushing that old growth to the top. All right, so again, if we look at growing point locations, depending on the species of grass or even the type of grasses, they're going to be very different. So Kentucky bluegrass is a common grass that we see in lawn species, and it's actually a common grass that in the Midwest as well. And so these growing points are going to actually be pretty high up, so or pretty low to the soil. So they're going to have more basal growing points than elevated growing points. Therefore, that's why it makes a really good lawn species, because you can actually cut these species of grasses pretty short, and they're going to come back very, very readily. However, if you have species of grasses that have elevated tillers or elevated growing points, like this right here, and you come through and you cut it with a mower, or you graze it very, very short, then because you took away those growing points, the plant loses its ability to extend more new tissue from those growing points. So they have to actually develop brand new tillers that are going to be established as part of the bunch grass. So just keep that in mind as you're contemplating how heavily to graze pastures. It really depends on the type of grasses you have in those pastures and where their growth points are located at. So again, with these grasses, you also have to be aware of their reproductive capacity as well. So keep in mind that some grasses are going to be rhizomatic, where they are going to extend or send out runners underneath the soil, and then some grasses are going to be stoloniferous, that are going to send out runners above the soil. Stoloniferous plants are a little more at risk for major disturbances such as grazing or mowing or some sort of disaster, just because the plant tissue that it reproduces from, the stolon, is above ground. So it has the ability to actually be consumed, or it's not very protected. Whereas the rhizomatic grasses tend to be a little more established, because they are going to reproduce from these runners that are going to be sent out underneath the soil. All right, so when thinking about growth points, again, we can have two main types when it comes to culms. So we can have culms that have an auxiliary bud at the soil, so like our Kentucky bluegrass, or we can have a culmed plant that actually has auxiliary buds up above the soil, so elevated growing points. So in these meristems are going to actually push new growth up, or push new growth from the growing point up towards the elevated area. So the older growth is actually going to be up to at the top here. So hopefully you guys, now that you have like 40 plants memorized, you can actually think about the different types of grasses that you've seen and whether they are going to have basal auxiliary buds or elevated auxiliary buds. All right, so location of growing points is very, very important in regards to season as well. So you've got to be aware of when those plants come on. So our C3 plants are going to be our cool season plants. They're going to tend to come on during the winter and the spring here in California, whereas our C4s are going to come on in the summer when it gets hot. So we want to make sure that with our cool season plants that we aren't grazing at too high of a level, because we would be removing those growing points and not allowing for reproduction of those plants to take place. All right, so when we think about shrubs, it's some of the similar concepts as with trees, or as with grasses in our shrubs, is we're going to have new growth versus old growth in our shrubs and our trees as well. However, it presents itself very differently compared to the grasses. So the forbs and the shrubs are going to initiate growth from the outermost points. So that's why you'll see new shoots that actually present themselves as leaves on shrubs, whereas the grasses are going to extend from those auxiliary buds. So if you guys are familiar with hedges at all, like in landscaping, if you see areas that have been hedged, then you know it has been heavily browsed. So if you, that hedging effect actually has the, you will actually start to see a hedging effect if you have a really high stocking rate that is not going to allow that plant to come back as readily as it needs to. All right, so then we also have our trees, and they're going to reproduce from the meristem. So in our pine trees, that meristem is actually in the middle of the needle area, and this helps to keep it protected. So those, just keep that in mind, that from trees and shrubs, their growth points are going to be very, very differently, and they're going to have different levels of productiveness associated with them.